Okay, can everyone see the screen? Thumbs up?
Yeah.
Great. So Urvashi, Indra and I all came together for a very specific conversation as you are here, which is on feminine intelligence. And the thing that we were seeing, especially in this time of the crisis, is that women are more directly being impacted than any other sector of the society. And we want to talk about that, and we want to talk about the importance of what we call feminine intelligence. We're going to cover a spectrum of conversations today, and that will be because feminine intelligence, the minute we use the word feminine, seems to call up many different interpretations from many different areas of society and also from genders. This conversation is one that we've all been having for some time, and we want to give it a context that feminine intelligence firstly exists in both men and women. It's not exclusive to women. So on one hand, we're talking about women, and the other, which is biology, and the other hand, we're talking about consciousness and a shift in qualities and consciousness that are necessary at this time. So I won't say any more about that for the moment, because we're going to come at this from three different approaches. So feminine intelligence, just to give it a context or an explanation, what we arrived at and what we know to be, or what we have seen, is if we were to address the burning challenges of our world today, we need to bring into balance the masculine and feminine qualities that exists within each of us, such that we utilize our full human capacities to solve the problems that we're facing. The emergence of a new level of consciousness where the deepest human instincts and intuition of both men and women, compassion, heart intelligence, and a longing to protect, heal, and make whole, find expression in ways that we may be described as a deep respect for all forms of life. These are the qualities required to flourish. For centuries, these qualities have been repressed and marginalized, and women have adapted to the system, ignoring their deep needs and feminine instincts. In this moment, we have the way to transform how we live. We have an opportunity to transform how we live and how we lead. So I want to just start out with that introduction to the feminine intelligence, but I'd like now for each of us to introduce ourselves. And we're going to start with Urvashi. If you could introduce yourself, Urvashi, and then I will put up your first slide based on your background and who you are and what you bring. So if you could please kick us off.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here, and especially gentlemen from Alabama at 4 a.m. I'm Dr. Urvashi Sahni, and I'm the founder and CEO of Study Hall Education Foundation. I'm also an Ashoka Fellow, a Schwab Fellow, and one of the co-creators of Catalyst 2030. I've been working for gender equality for 37 years now, more than half my life. And I chose deliberately education as the pathway to do it. Interestingly, my work was provoked by a crisis, a family crisis, where my own cousin, who was 24 with a 2-year-old child, was murdered because of dowry by her own family. And that really woke my feminist consciousness. And that's when I started to work with students and learned that unless girls and women learn that they're equal persons, deserving respect, education really doesn't do much for them. And that gender inequality largely is a part of mindsets. And education is the best place to change those. And I'll talk more about it as we go on. Indra.
So would you like, Urvashi, yeah, sorry, I will go back a step. Just if we start with the introductions, perfect. Indra, if you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes, hello. Just very briefly, I'm Indra Adnan, and I'm the founder and co-initiator of the Alternative UK, which is a new political platform, a global political platform of alternatives. And we exist to answer the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And we do three things. We produce a daily paper, we work work with the system, encouraging relationship with different parts of the system, and we build citizens action networks. And that's all I'll say for now.
Great, thanks, Indra. And my name is Karen Downs. I'm the founder of a consulting firm working in corporates to bring about human-centric organisations. It's called the Flourish Initiative. And I particularly chose that name. My own background, I come from a healing background in the 80s where I developed an international alternative healing company. And I grew that out of what I call the feminine principle, where we were a community, where it was about healing, it was about contribution and caring. And I bring that into organizations, and I particularly focus on the word flourishing because it is Mother Nature knows how to flourish. Mother Nature is the feminine. And if we listen and learn from those principles, we have a deeper understanding of how to run our organizations so that we prosper. I'm also the co-founder of FemQ, an organization that started 4 years ago that was passionate, where I came together with my colleagues and we're passionate about raising the awareness of the feminine intelligence to bring about the changes and transformation we need in the world right now. So we'll, having completed our, as you can hear, will come from very different perspectives as we unfold this conversation. At about halfway through the hour, we're going to ask any of you who really want to stay on the call, just to give you a structure of how this will go. We're each going to speak for about 7 minutes on our backgrounds and what we are focused on. And then we're going to ask everybody that wants to participate and partner, continue this conversation with us to bring this more powerfully, more strongly, and more in a structure. How can we bring this into the world to create the changes we need? And that's really what Catalyst 2030 is about. We're part of the organisation that is striving to reach the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, because at the current rate we're working, we won't get there, even if we do, until 2094. So we're passionate about addressing these because it's one of the models that we can all, in every sector of society, work to achieve, to make the difference for our planet and our lives and our species. So that said, perhaps Urvashi, now I'll go into your slide, and if you could please begin.
Yeah. So I really embarked on my work and started with a school in my own garage in 1986. And the way we looked at education was that, you know, education is not just about developing cognitive skills or academic skills, but teaching us how to live. And this is Boleslavsky, and he's a dramatist, and this is what he had to say. And we defined our goal of education, next slide, Karen, as enabling students and teachers to ask and answer the question, who am I and how am I related to the universe and others in it? Karen, if you put up that slide, it's the next one. Yeah. So right from the beginning, we took a very invitational approach and a very whole approach. When you look at life whole, and you look at students and their lives whole, and you invite them into the classroom whole. And that is why this term holistic education, because it's become very cliched really, and so I'm even a little nervous about using it. But it takes on a new meaning when you think about it as a whole approach to people and their lives. And I remember from my own education that you really had to leave yourself somewhere outside the classroom when you stepped in. And if you had to speak about yourself, the teacher would say, no, let's talk about the subject matter. And we take a very relational approach. And for now 34 years with education, we've been trying to develop curricula and pedagogies that will actually help students understand and ask the question, who am I and what is my relation to the universe and others in it? And I know that during this crisis, probably many people have been asking themselves this question. And I think if we reflect on our education, why I remember that's what started me off really on my work, that why has education never touched upon these things? Why didn't it ever think about who we are and how we are related to others in this world? And we just talk about the work with girls. So we worked with girls and women, and our main focus has been on trying to awaken a feminist consciousness, which really can be understood as really validating feminist intelligence. And by that, what I mean is for women to, first of all, learn to perceive themselves as equal persons deserving respect, having a right to their own flourishing, even in your term, I love that word, and their own thriving, with the right to access whatever skills they can, whatever learning they can, to enable their own lives and be drivers of that. And we have worked with boys and girls both and invited boys again to develop a feminist consciousness or to awaken their feminine intelligence, to build a sense of empathy and understand that though patriarchy is not their fault, it is very cruel to their sisters, their mothers, their girlfriends, all the women they love. And it leaves them with a huge stress and burden of being this macho man who should provide for everyone and take care of everyone. And trying to show them that they can learn to be different kinds of men if they will allow themselves to be. And in fact, be partners with their sisters and advocates for girls' equality. And in fact, being equal means being able to perceive someone else as equal. If they can think of themselves as equal person, then they must grant the same equality to others too. What we've also done and what I learned through this, and I must mention here that of course our organization is 90% female-led. And we believe that you have to build all of this in an ethic of care. That it is that you can only relate with someone if you can show that you care about the person, which involves listening and receiving the person whole with respect and with love. You know, love seems to be a bad word these days, but yes, with respect, with love. And that's what generates this mutual respect. So we really call our whole organization a universe of care, where you care not just for the students, you care for the teachers, caring for each other. And when I think of it, it reminds me really of the solar system, where all these planets, imagine hanging up there, and how are they holding themselves up? Because they're holding hands and they're caring for each other, and they are respecting and valuing each other and helping everyone stay afloat. So that's the way the organization is. And in terms of feminine intelligence, I know that when my feminist consciousness was awakened by the crisis that I spoke of, it was really me trying to understand myself as an equal person, actually learn to validate my own feminine intelligence and help it grow from that. So when this crisis hit, by the way, and we were shut down, and it's been now, how much, 8 weeks? And the schools were closed actually even before the official lockdown. I mean, suddenly we were thrown into our homes, there was no classroom, there were no students, what do you do? And whereas the government kept on about how we had quickly moved to online learning and quickly put your syllabuses online and move on with it, get on with it, what did our teachers do? Following their feminine intelligence and following the approach they've always taken, the whole approach. The first thing they did was get connected here with the poorer children. You found with the best intention, you could only connect with 50%. And then first question was, how are you feeling? Are you afraid? What can we do? Giving them information so that they won't be afraid. Are you hungry? Have you lost your job? Any savings? What's going on with you? Right? First that, then concern about their own safety where they were. Then gearing up to find, galvanizing all the forces, digital volunteers if they were not connected, trying to reach out to as many more as they could so that they started with 40% and now it's gone on to about 60%. But most importantly, the relational aspect came into the fore because they cared. They reached out and they reached out to their students as whole, even though they're teachers, because that's how we define being a teacher and education. And so it wasn't so difficult because you know, if you look at it, women, most of the women around the world, and especially in the kind of world we live in the developing world, in the global south, their lives are always in crisis. I know that our Prerna teachers are always dealing with crisis, always at risk of being pulled out and married off as early as 11 and 12, always at the risk of poverty, losing your job. So always at risk. At a health, it's always a crisis. Right? So crisis management in this case wasn't very difficult for teachers who have always defined their own role in a holistic way and defined education in a more holistic way. So the response was holistic, it was empathetic, it was thoughtful, and it was loving, and it was understanding what do you need and how can I help you? How can I enable your life and the learning that goes as part of it? And not just with girls, even with boys. With boys, we spoke to them and we said, you know, what can you do? First of all, can you make sure that your sisters and your mothers are safe at home these days? If there's any violence, this is where you reach out. Then can you make sure that you reach out to everybody else in your community? What will you do? And that worked hugely, so that our alumni, our students, our teachers, the whole community, it was a whole community effort. And I think I'm going to stop there for some time, Karen. And this is the last thing that I want to say with this, is that, you know, like you said, that feminine intelligence, think of mothers, and how intelligent they have to be to raise the children that they do and do everything that they do. And think of how little we validate them and how little we value them till they are gone. A man, he loses his wife, the next thing to do is, when can I find another wife who'll take care of me? A woman loses her husband, she's quickly up and about trying to find herself a job, get the food, feed her children, and do everything that it takes. And we have so much evidence. All the leaders in the world are women who are doing well. And there's a lot of other evidence. And yet we, just in Odisha, which is one of the states which has responded the best. By the way, they galvanized 700 women from the self-help groups who reached out within 3 days to 60,000 villages, went house to house, gave them the information, found out what they needed, and reached it to them. We have countless stories, right? And what do you know? I found this news item today, that they have found that more men are dying than women. Some lab. And they said, hey, well, maybe, you know, the female hormone has something to do with it. So guess what? In New York last week, some of them said, let's inject the female hormone in men and maybe that will help raise their immunity. And they're going to do that in LA next week too. So, I mean, this is just, I mean, it's a small little item and I don't know how much basis that is. But my point is that surely we have enough evidence that women bring something very special because they are women. And so far, their specialness has been considered a weakness and considered something to shame them with, to put them down with. There was this cleric in a neighboring country. He went on TV to say that we have this COVID crisis because women have become so shameless and Allah is punishing us. They're wearing shorter dresses. Yeah. So anything goes wrong, let's blame the women because they are in some way special creatures, instead of validating that they bring something very special to the world.
Thank you so much, Urvashi. And I want to just underscore, to lead into Indra's conversation, I want to underscore something that you said about the women mobilizing in 3 days. Because in India, as I know it well myself, is that, well, many women are illiterate. They're not able to go to school. So if you can't read and you can't write, what do you do to find out information? Is women come and take care of you. And so that's why it's so important to have this contextual conversation of the differences we're all contending with and what's happening during this time of crisis. So moving from the developing country of the beautiful country of India into mainstream here in London, Indra, if you could pick up the conversation from your perspective here.
Yes, thank you very much. And just to remind everyone that I run a political platform called The Alternative, which has existed for the past 3 years and part of a global network that's been around for 7 years now, to ask the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And in the UK, one of the conclusions that we've come to is that the real shift that could still occur is more women active and bringing their ways of working to the public sphere. So Urvashi's amazing work is clear and incontrovertible. Over half of our global population is marginalized, and in some cases, actively subjugated because of their sex. That this is not fair is obvious, but is it even wise? What else are we missing out by ignoring women and what they might bring to the public space if there were enough of us to make a difference? So in this moment of crises, many news outlets have shared the idea that women leaders have actually stood out in the handling of the crisis. Karen, do you want to show the slide now?
Sure. Whoops. Yep.
Not the first one. Yeah, thank you. So figures including Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan, Angela Merkel of Germany, Halima Yacob, Carrie Lam, the many are shown there. So in these articles, they've identified a number of qualities: emotional intelligence, systemic thinking, the ability to step aside to let scientific experts create confidence, quick, decisive action, empathy, but mostly knowing what the people need and being able to communicate effectively. Jacinda Ardern, for example, taking the emergency 100% seriously from the outset, closing the borders, stepping aside to give the scientists full authority, and returning quickly to assure everyone that her government was in full control. She's been holding press conferences for children so that their parents would not be overwhelmed with the task of explaining it all to them. Angela Merkel called a hackathon across the whole of the German Federation with 40,000 participants in the early days of the virus. That's not only to integrate the most ingenious and diverse ideas, but also to give the sense that responsibility lies with everyone. It's a shared challenge. What Urvashi was saying, it's a whole system, it's a whole shared opportunity. So this is not a new story. During the early noughties, I ran the Downing Street project, which was aimed specifically at bringing more women into politics. For 2 years, we dug deep into the question of whether or not it matters whether there are equal women and men in parliament. So interviewing and working with women, we heard how difficult it was for women to be themselves in the political sphere, and that in order to succeed, they had to adopt male behavior and culture. They would compete where they would rather collaborate. They would perform solo on the stage where they would much rather move into circles of engagement and deliberation and co-creation. Their ways of acting were always to bring into focus, as Urvashi said, the whole picture, the whole community, the whole problem. But once they moved into the political sphere, they had to move into these binaries and fight tooth and nail to win against the other. Today in the UK, we're at an all-time high of 34% of women in British Parliament, so it's not so impressive. Yet because of the prevailing culture, not much has changed about politics. Still only 2% of people all across Europe are members of political parties. That's really quite extraordinary, isn't it? They are still seen as disconnected from real life, overly competitive, and jousting in their nature. At this rate, it's been estimated it'll take another 90 years for women to reach parity, or maybe for politics to become to seem a more friendly place for people to participate. So in the Downing Street project, we asked the women, in conversation with other women, how would they design things differently if they had the chance? And much of what they designed placed relationship at the heart of the system, representing the individual human being as interrelated and codependent with the community. For a single person to thrive, they need a place of belonging within the community. For the planet to thrive, it needs healthy relationship with human activity, an economy built on interdependence. So can I have the next slide, Karen?
Mm-hmm.
So many of you will know Riane Eisler's Caring Economy, which includes all the work, domestic and relational work, mostly done by women, as key to a properly working economy. Or Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize-winning work on sustainable economies, which focuses on the development of the commons, the way that shared common assets can be viable beyond state and market, but only if they're actively and responsibly cared for by self-confident communities. Or maybe Kate Raworth's work on donut economics, which stresses that the core relationship between the thriving individual, the community we care for, and the planetary boundaries that delimit our survival on this planet these three women economists are slowly coming into the bigger picture as we start to think differently about the planet. But let's get back to this moment in the COVID crisis. At the Alternative UK, where I'm now working with men and women to emerge a new politics based on these principles of the interconnection of I, we, and world, we've been supporting citizen action networks that can connect whole communities to what we call the cosmo-local solutions now available. So when the pandemic appeared in these communities, they were ready with their networks to help vulnerable people in the lockdown. So the basic principles of relational welfare and organization are going to become ever more important in the coming years to help keep us not only resilient, but also flourishing as we face the ongoing challenges. And with that, I'd like to hand you back to Karen Downs, who will tell us much more about what flourishing actually means.
Thank you, Indra. So thank you so much, because I think everybody on the call, all of us, would agree that a challenge is that we confront in trying to, as we have for decades between the three of us, been working to bring about a shifting consciousness. And so I want to begin with my own journey slightly, not as an introduction, but as a measurement for myself over the decades that I've worked with women and for women. In my own business, when I created an aromatherapy company in Australia, I based it on having no understanding of business. I hadn't even finished high school. And I grew it into a multi-million-dollar business. And it was based on this exact structure that Indra has presented here. It was based on relationships, on healing, on empowerment of women finding their agency, having their voice, taking care of themselves and others as they wish to, with an alternative, which was aromatherapy in the home. We built that business. Majority of our staff were women, and the men that came into the business found themselves in a system and a community that allowed them to be more human, more compassionate, understanding, have greater feelings and care for themselves and for others. So we actually watched the feminine principle flourish inside that organisation without a structure, without a mindset that it was feminine, but basically my sister and I operating from our intuition. What would it take to build a community? What would it take to build a flourishing enterprise where people were empowered? And that's how I got into the Hunger Project. So if I look back, what I was doing then would be called now conscious leadership. So it wouldn't be called feminine leadership, it would be called conscious leadership, because that's now the new term of how do we build conscious leaders that embrace the feminine principle. Because we, as Urvashi, Indra and I have spoken about as we prepared for this call, we also spoke about how resistant people are of hearing the word either feminism, feminine, or female of any sort, because it sounds like we've got an agenda when we're speaking in a biological body that is female, or we are women. So I want to presence that was how I built an organisation based on these principles, but also led me into the Hunger Project when I went to India to work with women on the ground in their villages, where we created vision, commitment and action workshops, because it was actually found out statistically that hunger had nothing to do with food. The chronic persistence of hunger, not famine, which is to do with food, but the chronic persistence of hunger was caused by the subjugation and marginalisation of women. And that was the agenda of the Hunger Project, was to educate and empower women in their full agency so that they could become authors of their own lives and build sustainable economies and communities and take agency in their own lives. And that was an incredible journey, because that was also where I got to see that we can't just talk about feminine intelligence and consciousness when we have a major problem with gender and the subjugation and marginalisation of women, which has existed for centuries. So this is an important conversation for us, because we have to have and think about context of where we're having this conversation. So if I go into an organisation and speak about gender, inclusivity and diversity is a huge topic in organisations and corporates where I work. And therefore they think the measurement of a metric of a woman sitting at the table is critical, and that gives them diversity. But the men are not addressing their own biases and their qualities that have actually gotten them to where they are, which is in a huge problem and the crisis we're now facing, not just with the coronavirus, but in our economies and in our ecology. And men are not facing that it's not just about women sitting at the table, it's the system they've created that perpetuates the problem, which is what's valued in corporations is position, title, status, intellect, predominantly what we would call and refer to in Ian McGilchrist's work on the left and right hemispheres. Predominantly, they are rewarded for the left brain qualities of measurement, targets, KPIs, performance. So in the Flourish initiative, I go into the corporates and start to talk about what does it take to flourish, to build resilient business communities, because teams compete, which is what businesses do. They build their teams, they have team building exercises, and it raises, again, the qualities of competition versus collaboration. It does not honour diversity. It actually suggests that only the best will be chosen in a team, whereas in a community, people share values. So we have to, especially in this crisis, where we've seen the human qualities of care and collaboration and contribution being exhibited because of a crisis, if we can, this crisis can be an opportunity to harness those qualities that we are calling the feminine qualities of care, of community, of resilience, of flourishing as Mother Nature does. We can harness those qualities and say, this is the new world that we wish to build. So as I speak about the corporate, one of the statistics that I read recently due to the virus, as we started this conversation about feminine intelligence to do this presentation, one of the statistics I read is that here in the United Kingdom, one of the organisations, I think their name is Refuge, is they have had an increase of 700% increase in calls from women who are receiving or scared or afraid of what's happening in their home environment, and a 39% increase in domestic violence. This is under isolation, under pressure, the trauma and the issues that we have not dealt with either in the domestic sector, in the corporate sector, in the political arena that Indra has addressed, and in the systems that Urvashi has addressed. All of it, we know the statistics, but something is stopping it from shifting. And I want to presence that when I have this conversation about feminine intelligence, when we started FemQ, I'm the co-founder of an organisation called FemQ. And when we started this conversation and we led four international summits, and we said feminine intelligence is something that both women and men have, that it has not been allowed to be developed or considered a resource for men. So how can we elevate that consciousness? Out of almost 1,000 people that attended those 4 summits, when we started in Berlin, we had 140 people from 17 countries. And out of those 140, we had, I think it was 9 men. Why don't men, and I asked the men on the call, why don't men want to participate in this conversation? And when I had that recently at a conference that Indra and I were at last year, and I asked 10 men to join me, what is the confront? What is the challenge? What is it that they get triggered by when they hear me or any woman speaking about feminism, or feminine intelligence? And one of them in particular said to me, you're taking us backwards, Karen, it's binary. We're over patriarchy, we're over the male gender thing, female gender thing. And I said, but what about the women in India? I carry them in my heart. What about them? So until our planet, not just our system or our geography, honours the feminine and looks at Mother Nature, and look at what she's doing right now. I'm looking out over Kew Gardens here in London, and she's healing. She knows how to flourish. Let's listen to her for the feminine. So that's, I'd like to finish there and say that how important this conversation is and how we can take the crisis into an opportunity, because that's what crisis is. When people face crisis, they either become traumatized and they degenerate within emotionally, and they can go into the traumatic, post-traumatic stress disorder, as we know this so well, or they become it becomes a transformative process, and they grow from it, as Urvashi said, in India, where they're facing crisis every day. So I'd like to open it up, and let's take this conversation into partnership conversation. We would love all of you on the call to stay with us and have this conversation about partnering with us to find a way that we can address the contextually, from gender through to consciousness. And it's always a contextual conversation, but how do we have this conversation to shift the metrics? But more than that, how do we shift the system? Because women becoming more like men doesn't make them equal. So we have to look at the feminine and how we bring that about in men and women. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Can I just, in terms of asking for partnerships and what we'd like, and for girls on helping raise their, we call it very bravely feminist consciousness, let them look at themselves as equal and respect themselves for girls and develop voice and agency, and look at boys learning to develop empathy, learning to develop a more egalitarian perception of masculinity. And we are looking for NGOs and educators all over the world, and particularly in our parts of the world, we are happy to share these curricula, help with the teacher training, and do everything we can, because I believe it should be made of movement. We are jumping up and down at the number of deaths we've had, and they are terrible during COVID. God, if you only knew how many women die every day. There are 500,000 sex-selective abortions of female fetuses in India. There are 4 rapes every day in India. And by the way, in India, it's much more stark. I wish I could meet that gentleman who accosted you, or whom you spoke to. I would tell him that it's not just in India. In India, it's very visible. It's more invisible in countries where they think that they're done with patriarchy. Not true. Count the number of female leaders you have in the world. Count the number of people in politics that you have anywhere, or leaderships in corporates, CEOs. Okay, look at families and what's going on there, right? So I don't believe that it's the case that patriarchy, by the way, is, I think when people talk about it, is a democratic project. Patriarchy has no place in a democracy. So one, we'd like to partner with other NGOs and educators to help make this a part of the official curriculum. I think lessons of equality are just as important as lessons of math, science, language, and the lessons of democracy, really. And they should be put in the official curriculums. We'd like advocates and we'd like NGOs. Secondly, we've launched a very large feeding program, because there are hundreds of thousands of millions, actually, of migrant workers. And many of their students work with us. So in their communities, where we have fed so far 35,575 meals to be exact, and we could take it up to 300,000, because this is going to be for another 200 years, for another, oh please no, 2 months. And so we would love any kind of funding or help to do that. It's 20 cents a meal. That's all. Then we've noticed that the digital divide is really a bad one. So that people who need, I told you we haven't been able to reach 50% of our either because they have no devices, or because fathers have it and they have access to them. Therefore, we plead with the fathers and we manage to get that.
Urvashi, sorry to interrupt you, my dear. I'm going to have to open up, because I really want to also have people's voices in our room. We've only got 15 minutes left. So Indra, and I want to give you the opportunity to speak as well, but I'd like to open up and hear from anybody. If you could raise your hand, I'm just going to see if I can do this. If anybody would like to ask a question or state their position in terms of partnering, how can they partner, how can they support from the educational perspective, as Urvashi has spoken, from the political that Indra is speaking from, and the corporate that I was speaking from. So really, I want to open that up and hear some other voices as well. please. Please, Michaela.
So, well, Karen, you know a little bit about my work in the university. What question that I'm left with, or I'm trying to address or research and address, is how do we create spaces where transitions can happen? And spaces is, and this is the challenge that I'm facing, is that space is a relational space, but it's also a dimensional space. And we are in an era of transition, and the shift does need to construct intentional spaces for that space, for that shift to happen. And how, so for me, it's an architectural, it's also an architectural, structural question, how actually to manifest it. Yeah, that's my, right now what I'm trying to do in the university, and I'm very challenged with it because it becomes a mindfulness class, but I'm trying to create a space where I call it sacred space, where students practice the bridges between the I, we, and the world. But it's something that needs to be practiced in all the realms that you, Karen, talked about. But for me, it's still a challenge, and it's still something very wishy-washy, or still not very, maybe I would love to hear.
Indra, would you be able to respond to Michaela?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's, in a way, it's almost a very feminine question, and one that does need to be addressed, because at the heart of everything is relationship. How do we create spaces for relationship to occur? And, you know, my own experience is trying in the political field of trying to stand for Parliament, for example, is that the difficulty of operating alone and standing on a stage and speaking to an anonymous audience was the beginning of the problem and the beginning of the disconnect. So we always do all of our events in circles. We always require connection between twos and then fours and then sixes. But it's important, as you say, to create space for relationship building, to create containers of trust before we move into the more practical aspects of what are we here to do and what are we going to build. So for me, it's almost like it is architectural. It's moving in a way from straight lines to more circular aesthetic everywhere. We're talking about circular economy, you know, circles of democracy, a sociocracy as means of organization, and so on. So it's subtle, but it can become quite a foundation for ways of acting and being together.
I also, thank you, Indra. I want to build on comments that Urvashi and John have placed in the chat box in regards to education and schools as spaces. And Michaela, you've pointed to the university that you work in to create sacred spaces. I had an experience, my own daughter went to the Steiner School, so it was very relational orientated. Imagination and creativity were the things that were fostered in their education. Then I had the experience of when in my working career, I was in a corporate environment, and one of the graduates from Oxford said to me she wanted to create a circle, a women's circle. And now she'd moved from Oxford. My own experience of schooling of Steiner School was very different to an Oxford University students. And she was saying that the gender wasn't a problem as she was coming through Oxford. Everyone was very supportive, everyone was equal, they didn't think of themselves as gender, and now she found herself in a corporate environment. She wanted to create a women's circle because she saw that women were not speaking out, and she didn't understand that because she hadn't come from that environment. And someone, as I was working in this project, someone said to me, I think you're taking us backwards, Karen. I think the young people don't have a problem with gender. And I was with this woman from Oxford working in at the corporate environment. 3 months after she started the Women's Circle and it started in the corporate world, she was off for 6 weeks with depression. One of the assertions I would make is that even if a girl, a woman, has been educated to be empowered and have agency, when she hits a system that is so strong, called a patriarchy, hierarchy, dictatorship in many corporates, when she hits that system, she can't adjust because the system often doesn't support. So we have to look at, this is why this is such an important conversation, that we're looking at all of the systems. And as Indra said, the relationship, as Urvashi has said, the agency, the notion of the whole person. These are all critical conversations. This is not an easy conversation. So let's have it in context, but no, when this woman said to me, there's not a problem, when people hit the current system, they can't cope. It's why so many people are opting to be social entrepreneurs and activists, because the system isn't serving them anymore, isn't serving the millennials. Please, Urvashi.
Kermit also had his hand up.
In fact, the system, because you mentioned that, a lot of, we faced a lot of flack from many people, other educators and even other feminists, saying that, oh, but you're really leaving them very vulnerable to more violence because you're teaching them to resist and they're understanding it is wrong. And then because the system hasn't changed. The way we worked around that, that's why the relationships is so important. By building bridges into the community.
Yes.
By taking the system along with us and trying to make this a systemic approach so that parents do this. Homework would be, for example, interview your mom and ask her what her marriage was like. Boy, interview your sister and find out how she's feeling, right? And some of our students have come out with this priceless fun at the end with the boys. Oh, I've suddenly learned that girls have feelings and they're like us and they are, they're like human, almost as we say, suddenly, aha, they're human. So with the parents too, so I think whereas the system is a huge wall, right? And we all face that, even now. But at the same time, the way we position it is, then what's the alternative?
Yes, so
we don't shake that wall.
Absolutely.
And so how do you then try to also make them agents of change where they can change the system? So taking a systemic approach in education toward systems change.
Great. Thank you, Urvashi. And Indra, you were watching. Did Kermit have a question?
Kermit had a question, yeah.
Thank you. Kermit, if you could unmute.
Mute. You have to unmute.
I'll say not so much a question, but just sharing my thoughts. And certain things have been mentioned and all the ladies are like, yeah, we need that. Like shared spaces, safe spaces. I think men are just very primitive and it's how we're built and it's how we're wired, right? We're really into food, sex, and power. And when any one of those, those are just kind of the things we care about. When you talk about a system change, you're talking about taking power in many ways. What a guy hears with half of the humans here on the earth is you're taking something away from me, right? And that's very uncomfortable. So to go through the front door of the problem, I don't think it's the best approach. I think you have to come through the kitchen window in a way. And there's lots of studies that back this up. When, just trying to get a guy to correctly pee in a toilet is a problem, right? If any of you live with men and we are messy creatures, how do you get a guy to pee in a toilet correctly? And there's been a lot of studies on that. And if you ask them to do it correctly, it's not going to happen. If you put signs up, it's not going to happen. This is in public restrooms and at home. Because if you can do that, I think you can change the world for the most part. and there's a thing like in men's urinals where you can put a bee. It looks like a bee at the bottom of a urinal, and guys will actually aim at it like you trade a 2-year-old. And an indirect approach to fixing a problem, so you're not tackling a man's ethos or ego, I think is the answer. I could expand on that, but I'm going to be quiet.
Thank you so much, Corinne. Worthy of saying, and totally get it. And I think that I'd have to say that we on this call, the three of us, have been in this trying to go about it subtly, fighting for it, trying to change it. Me going in with the Flourish Initiative, for me, was going in the back door, taking in the Trojan horse. The notion of flourishing is very soft, but an invitation. But it's still not heard. It's thrown out because it's too soft and it's too. So I think it's a very big conversation. But I want to optimize the last 5 minutes of the call by saying that I want to share the screen again, and what the three of us are really passionate about is a 3-pronged approach that we're working with. So I really invite you. I'm going to put our contact details up. Urvashi has shared her organisation, Indra hers, from please contact all of us, and me from the Flourish Initiative, and both Indra and I are both doing other talks later in the day on our own organisations. But this is what we consider a 3-pronged approach: is direct and immediate action, where exploitation, domination and mismanagement, not only of our natural resources, but of our natural resource of the feminine, is not being noticed or applied. Education and inner work. So it's the education, both from building agency, but also a shift in consciousness and a change in the system. This 3-pronged approach was actually initiated by Joanna Macy, who said if we're going to move from an industrial growth structure and system into a life-sustaining future, we have to have all 3. So whether it's direct action, where you take action and demonstrate in the streets, you may not be up for that, but we'd love your partnership in any one of these, where you can contact Indra, Urvashi or myself on these details I'm just about to put up. And we would love, there we are. We would love to hear from you, and please get in touch with us and see if you can partner or support in the work that we're doing, from the education of girls and empowerment of women in India with Urvashi, in politics and the feminization of politics with Indra. And please check out her web, her email, via email, her web address, and me with the Flourish Initiative in corporates, and FemQ as a not-for-profit organisation expounding feminine intelligence. So I'm conscious of time, and I just want to invite my colleagues, Indra first, and then Urvashi, to complete the conversation if you've got something just in the last couple of minutes to share. Indra?
Yes, I think my last thought would be that we are in an extraordinary moment right now. We're having a global conversation and a global pandemic. And I'd like to invite anyone to think now about what could change at this moment and how we could shift into some radical new direction, and that we've offered something for that. Thank you.
Urvashi?
Yeah. Just to echo that actually, as we've been talking amongst ourselves, we're a team of 400 people, by the way. And so as we talk almost every day, every week, one of the things that we've been trying to figure out is what are lessons to learn forever, and how can we hang on to those, and how can we then develop, and that's an opportunity, like you said, to build a new system. And I think in this, perhaps it is time for, and I am sure that many people are seeing how caring is what is saving the day. You know, caring, empathy, connectedness. This is what is really helping sustain us through this crisis. I'm hoping people will stay with that.
Yeah. Thank you, Urvashi. And my last words are that I'm working in corporates, and at the moment corporate are looking at the problem of how the domestic and the public have become one, with the stress that's being exhibited. Doctors I've been speaking to, a neurologist has said that the doctors and carers are now more concerned about the mental health issues, concerns and trauma that this virus will cause than the virus itself. I think to have these safe circles, to have open conversations where we can care for each other, and it is an opportunity to embody and embed the feminine qualities, but don't let them go when the crisis is over, because that's the risk, is that the crisis ends and people want to normalize or go back to what was normal, and there is no normal. So let's practice and rehearse these qualities that are so needed in the world today, not just in the crisis, but going forward for our planet and our flourishing future. So thank you so much, everyone, for being on the call. And Kermit, bless you for being up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Thank you so much.
Thank
Please
you.
get in touch. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.